good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining a CUBIN webinar today. I would like to just ask if you can hear me well. Maybe you can send me a chat if you can hear me well and there's no problem on the sound. Okay, thank you for those who respond. Okay, so we will start now. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the CUBIN webinar on removing cultural barriers to innovation. My name is Marta Octavia, CUBIN team from SPI Portugal, our moderator of today, also together with my colleague, Ms. Alexandra Paksiova from Hofstede Insights, Finland. This webinar is a part of the virtual training courses and one of the main tools from the CUBIN platform, which is a platform that designed to help European SMEs with business and innovation in emerging markets. For now, I will hand over to my colleagues Alessandra to introduce you with CUBIN. Alessandra, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Martha. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar today. First of all, for those who are not familiar with the CUBIN platform, I would like to shortly introduce the project. CUBIN was set up by a consortium of experts in the field of cultural differences with the involvement of SME support and innovation agencies. CUBIN stands for Cultural Understanding for Business Expansion and Innovation. Besides these webinars, as Martha already mentioned, CUBIN provides an online library and a self-assessment tools where you can test your knowledge about the countries and regions in the scope of the project. CUBIN project is fully financed by the European Commission. Our today's speaker, Manuel Seifert, is a senior consultant at Improve Academy, leading projects in various states of Europe in both public and private sector. Manuel is in charge of projects focusing on innovation management and digitalization for companies from startups to multinational corporates. With 10 years of experience in consultancy and business planning, Manuel has operational insights on innovation management and applying agile work techniques in daily business. After the presentation, we will have some time allocated to your questions, so please feel free to share all your questions using the question section on the right side of your screen in the control panel. At the end of the webinar, we will try to answer as many questions as possible within the allocated time. So now I would like to welcome our speaker. Manuel, thank you very much for joining us today. We are looking forward to your presentation. The floor is yours.
Hi and welcome. Thank you very much, Martha. Thank you, Alexandra. Let me just go and share my screen real quick so that we can get started. Please let me know once this works. I hope that you can all see my screen, see the presentation. Very happy to be here today to be a speaker and provide you with my or our expectation on removing cultural barriers to innovation. Maybe a short background. Thanks for the introduction already of me personally. Short background, 2 sentences to the Improve Academy. Improve is a standalone entity today. It's a non-profit consultancy active for about 6 years already and emerged out of an EU flagship program to bring innovation management to SMEs all across Europe. We're providing consultancy training and have an assessment database where you can benchmark your individual, or if you're working with clients, your clients' individual innovation management capacities benchmarked against other competitors anonymously, obviously. But that's what we do, focusing on innovation management, digitalization. Very happy to be here. Now, without losing too much time on the introduction part, I'm also happy to go into questions right after the core contents. What I'd like to cover today is the key dimensions of innovation culture, then diving into defining appropriate recommendations, how to improve the resources for a more innovative oriented culture, defining the business impact of these recommendations, and the fourth part will be removing cultural barriers even outside your own company, your own entity. What we want to achieve is to turn innovation culture into a strong driver for innovation success. And we want to help you understand the path from enhancing your own capacities and capabilities, becoming what we consider and label a change agent, and then finally drive that change onwards. Throughout the next couple of minutes, we see three major steps that we're going to go through and that we're going to use as kind of guidance or structure throughout the whole webinar. So removing cultural barriers in our belief depends on first gaining transparency. That includes that you are able to identify what are the cultural barriers within your organization and have them then as a basis for discussion within the entity, within an SME, for example, or if you're more working as an intermediate, maybe your clients are SMEs focusing and struggling with those barriers. What you can use is our benchmarking tools, our benchmarking reports, as said. They shed a light on various aspects of innovation management, and you can allocate resources to the areas defined within the reports as the most crucial ones. Obviously, you might be already very experienced with this topic, so having your own experience and your own project examples in the background of you being able to detect and address the cultural barriers appropriately is also a very big help. As second step, we see the development of effective recommendations and actions as crucial. So for each stakeholder group and each hierarchy level, there might be slightly different aspects to be considered as barriers. For each dimension of the innovation culture, there might be different barriers. And then for each aspect within the organization, such as the different departments, or such as different structures, for example, there again might be different barriers. Finally, the third step will be defining the business impact of the actions that you base on the recommendations. So business impact in terms of financial impact, such as profit or revenues, reduction of cost, obviously, and also the possibility to increase agility and innovation success, or for example, work on more short, medium, or long-term oriented aspects and objectives. Before we use this threefold approach to follow throughout the next couple of slides, I want to quickly address the topic of change, as removing cultural barriers also includes that there potentially will be change. Now, a changing behavior is always a challenge. It is always easier or less of an effort to have something stay the same. But if you start on the very bottom and you or your clients do see the benefit of innovation, that's the first step. Then understanding the required changes is what is necessary at a next level. Followed by knowing how to initiate the required changes and mobilizing the teams, engaging and motivating employees, having the team on board to also support and proactively drive this change is important. Enjoying the success of the adopted innovation, and finally embed the change for the future. So to think ahead are then the ultimate next steps and last steps of this ladder to climb from a status quo overcome the barriers that you defined, identified, and were able to tackle, and then result in something that is hopefully a new and better possibility to work and to achieve innovative results. Now, as already said, we're going to dive into this three-step approach, and the key dimensions of innovation culture are the first one we're about to tackle. The innovation organization and culture as part of the Kearney House of Innovation, which we as Improve Academy have developed with Kearney, our mother company. This house includes several aspects and several dimensions. On top of the pyramid, as you can see, is the strategy, but already below that, so kind of the second step after the strategy, is where we are adding on the topic today, and where we say driving the force for innovation is organization, culture, and innovation aspects of those. Now, to fill up the gaps here of this house, below that we have the innovation lifecycle management, where it's all about idea management, continuous development, prototyping, etc. And then finally, launch and improvement or maintenance of the results. Finally, there are additional enablers supporting all this development in terms of innovation successes, and we will see innovation results as hopefully the successful outcome of this overall process. If we're having a look at the culture aspect, and especially then innovation culture, we define innovation culture according to 4 dimensions, being leadership, which is a critical aspect of a cultural atmosphere and a cultural togetherness. The shared values that are necessary in order to align on a potential innovation culture. The innovation-friendly climate, including behavior, but also additional enablers within an entity or organization. And finally, common behavior to reduce efforts for alignment, to know that we are on the same page, that we are walking or driving in the same direction, and that it's not necessary to align on all the details because everybody's already thinking somewhat similar. That does not mean that I want to streamline employees in an entity, but that does mean that the kind of the swim lanes for a specific topic need to be set in order to be successful and not to lose time on the way towards a specific objective. Now, I said in the first couple of sentences that the barriers might depend on hierarchy levels, on structures, might depend on different departments within an organization. And here is an exemplary chart where you see cultural barriers for innovation and that they are often people-driven. Now on the bottom, you can see the x-axis horizontally, where we have management, team, and individual as the differentiating factors. On the vertical axis, however, we see different categories. There's shared values, there's leadership, there's common behavior, and the innovation-friendly climate, the 4 categories I just introduced. If you now have a look and you see that behind those colorful boxes, there's this shady area from formal organization to rather informal organizations, as those 2 types are the organizational types that we see typically behind those cultural barriers. And now within these boxes, you see a couple of examples on per dimension example referring to the specific individual team or management personality. If you take, for example, the first box on the top and left, there's the lack of qualification and knowledge in innovation culture development or a low tolerance for mistakes as a cultural barrier from the management perspective, hindering an innovation-friendly atmosphere and climate. These hurdles, the one I mentioned and similar examples from the other dimensions, have to be overcome in order to get the organization into a position where the culture and climate enables all, including the employees, but also the business as such, to really work and be successful with innovative ideas. Now, I'm very happy to dive into all these details here in the boxes. However, to not spend too much time of your valuable time today on this one chart, please let me continue with the next following slides, and I'm very happy to dive back into details if you might have any questions specifically on that. When looking at the most successful innovators, we see commonalities among those. Right? We have analyzed our benchmarking database when we also look at our projects that we deliver, or even if you refer to publicly available information, there's elements that seem to be in common for very strong innovation-oriented cultures. Here we have 6 exemplary dimensions that we find and derive out of everything that we experienced and were able to analyze and research in our past works. So there's innovation as high priority and as key driver for competitiveness. There are entities, organizations relying heavily on innovation as a fact and not as a side aspect of business, but as core of their ideology and their strategies in order to be competitive, to survive at the market. There's openness to new technologies, processes, ideas, and people. That includes curiosity on developments, on opportunities and challenges that might be occurring along the way. There is also openness in terms of mindset openness and not sticking too much to routine jobs or to routine development and processes. It is also openness in terms of open innovation aspects, being willing and curious to work with partners, to work with stakeholders, to work with someone else along the value chain and not being stuck around maybe already asking customers, but only customers. Why not include other shareholders along the value chain? Collaboration internally and externally is the exactly next step on this open innovation aspect, meaning that companies and organizations should be willing to collaborate and to join forces both with internal sources such as employees and with external sources, and there we have customers, we have suppliers, we have other value chain partners. To some extent, it's also possible to team up with competition depending on the circumstances and the very specific topics and ideas. Partnering with complementary skill profiles. Everybody is looking for the higher profile employees, but we can't always have only the top 1%. Sometimes the best minds and the best skill profiles are not included in our own organization. Therefore, partnering shares an additional opportunity to get access to very highly skilled resources on people. Sharing benefits based on fair play. Wherever we analyzed and wherever we see project examples of very innovative driven cultures, fair play seems to be a common rule, that no one is trying to take over what's not his or hers, and everybody is willing to share in this community, in this collaboration partnership to a certain degree. And then finally, a track record in successful innovation projects is also something that we could elaborate on. We see that companies who follow these rules tend to have not 1 or 2 very successful innovative projects, but rather a sheer mass of those. So it seems that these underlying elements really lead to what we consider to be an innovation culture or innovation driven culture, and that again leads to continuous and recurring successes. Now, having understood this, defining appropriate recommendations to improve resources for an innovation culture is the next chapter. Being now in the second step and developing recommendations for each cultural barrier, again, we suggest to follow the House of Innovation because we have a clear structure from strategies, then the cultural aspect, the lifecycle management, enablers, and finally, kind of including everything, the results. So we have a 5-step strategy approach. And in order to develop recommendations, we have a simple plan or map that we want to share. Map and list all currently observable cultural barriers in the dimensions strategy. So starting from the very top of the house, working our way through. Derive individually case-based long list of recommendations on how to tackle exactly these cultural barriers that you just defined. Then define a relevant subset of recommendations for each of the cultural barriers that you find or did found in this dimension, and please document very precisely. It's not about structure-loving approach, it's about being able to refer back to what you had before and being able to make adjustments throughout the way. Therefore, documentation is something that we also highly recommend. Finally, following the same approach for each of the new dimensions, organization and culture, lifecycle management, enabling factors, is what we recommend as 4th step. This is finally leading to a nice set of developed appropriate recommendations. How this could look like in a more visualized way is starting with step 1, where you analyze the first dimension of the House of Innovation. Then you analyze the first and the second dimension to see if there's overlap, if there's a spillover or interconnectivity between these two. Then you would do the second and third dimensions, and so on and so on. Always including and referring back to the steps before to see whether you have clear connections and you want to include a bit more than you initially thought of. Once these recommendations are defined, they can be clustered, and here we suggest to have these 4 dimensions of innovation culture as introduced before, being leadership, shared values, the innovation-friendly climate, and common behavior. Now, very specific recommendations obviously depend heavily on the underlying cultural barriers. And I think it's best if I'm not presenting only 1 or 2 as the holy grail, but if we can agree on this structure as being a positive approach on how to tackle cultural barriers and how to come up with recommendations and thoroughly think of all the aspects that belong to innovation management and not only the pure development, for example, but starting from the strategy, including the cultural aspect we're discussing today, the life cycle management from idea to market launch, and then also the enabling factors. I think if we dive into all of these, I'm very happy to have the Q&A session for more specific questions on examples or on how might we address a certain particular case that you're thinking of. Now, we already covered the first step of being able to identify cultural barriers. The second step was here how to come up with recommendations following the House of Innovation. And then we have the third step, which is defining the business impact of the recommendations to remove cultural barriers. Here, what we see is that recommendations to remove cultural barriers will only be implemented if they have a clear impact. Business impact is threefolded according to our belief and experience. There are the basic levers of increased revenues and profits, reduce time to market and time to profit, and align with SME's ability to change. So for the first pillar, you have innovation related products, services, business models, whatever part of innovation the company is working on. New processes and approaches require less costs. That is everything, including the possibility to increase revenues and or profit. The second pillar, reducing time to market and time to profit, is based on faster decision making, faster throughput, and maybe less rework based on build quality in. Aspects of this second pillar very often include agile working methods, as the agile methods allow for more iterative aspects, for more iterative and loop designed approaches on how to manufacture, how to process, including customer feedback, including shareholder feedback early on, might first of all sound like it takes longer and there's more investment to make. But in reality, these aspects and these projects are able to adapt faster, to include learnings early on, and then to move forward into the overall goal here of the second pillar, to remove time to profit, because the solution that has been developed was more customer centric from the beginning, as feedback was included early on. Now, the third business impact that we see in recommendations to overcome cultural barriers is leadership to drive the change. So leadership was mentioned as one of the core dimensions before, and being able to drive the change necessary to overcome cultural barriers is essential to also lead to business impact. A time and ambition to implement the recommendations and the strength to maintain the improved innovation management. So the discipline to follow up on what has been developed as the new best solution is really crucial in order to be successful and also financially, business-wise, see impact. The allocation of the recommendation by business impact and ease of implementation is what we also want to highlight here in order to give you a full picture on how to address and overcome cultural barriers. The recommendation matrix, for example, might be like you see here on this slide. We have two axes again. We have the vertical axis being the business impact and the horizontal being the ease of implementation. Now you can think of potential recommendations, whatever that might be depending on the situation, but let's assume we have those 6 examples we have here mapped on this slide. So you would have recommendations on the very bottom part being rather easy rather low in the business impact, and then the ease of implementation is really low. That means that they are really hard to implement. It really takes lots of effort, or maybe resources, know-how, skills, maybe not internal skills, but external partners. So there's a high effort in introducing them. Then we have what is colored here as kind of the medium parts in the center of the graph, with somewhat moderate business impact and different levels of the ease of implementation. Number 6 being the easiest to implement of these moderately evaluated recommendations, and number 2 being the hardest, but also having kind of the highest business impact. And then the recommendation number 5 in the dark gray labeled corner, where it's comparatively easy to implement and has a huge impact business-wise. And now on the right side, you can see the summary of what does it mean in terms of what to address then. Obviously, the first one is not worth considering. The second one is difficult to implement, but has a high impact on the business. So should be not the first, but maybe the second or at least the third one. The third one is not worth considering either, similar to the first one. The fourth one should be considered for a second wave, similar to number 6. And number 5 should be the highest priority. Now you can argue that that is quite obvious, yes, but this is an approach that's not that often taken, and therefore we can only recommend you and suggest you to follow these approaches when considering what to implement, even when working on cultural aspects and not on the core product or the core process for your main customers. Please take recommendations to overcome cultural barriers and the change that is needed in order to get there as serious as your core products or your clients' core products. Removing cultural barriers across company borders. I hope you're still with me and this ride through the 3 steps of how to identify cultural barriers, how to come up with recommendations, and then finally how to implement these recommendations and see the business impact was good enough for you to get some first insights and get some ideas of potential frameworks to follow and how to tackle potentially cultural related aspects in your innovation management. Now, removing cultural barriers across companies' borders, so thinking outside of your own home turf, thinking outside your entity's borders and more along the value chain or into existing partnerships. We see that removing cultural barriers is even more a challenge if you add more stakeholders to the puzzle. So you would add suppliers, customers, maybe innovation partners to the game by still starting from the dimensions of innovation culture, but now you have to consider different points of view. The collaboration between partnerships in innovation partnerships can have various aspects, can have various pros and cons. However, it can help both young and also established companies to address a number of challenges. And what we've mapped here on this slide is on the left side for you, the maybe young or dynamic companies that might be startups, maybe SMEs to some extent. And on the right side, you see the established companies, probably corporates or just larger entities. Both of them have a profile relating on capabilities and challenges. And the interesting part now, in order to overcome barriers, is for you or for everyone involved in such a situation, please be at least willing, try to understand your vice versa contact. So understanding the capabilities of young companies is something that might be hard for corporates, but it's necessary in order to overcome cultural barriers. The same holds true for challenges, and for example, young companies or startups have to understand the challenges that a corporate or just an established company might be facing when looking at cultural aspects of innovation management. There's a variety of examples here, and some are maybe more common knowledge, that such as higher degree of flexibility in younger firms, or maybe the more regularity and compliance expertise on the established side. In addition, I think on that slide, you probably have own experience that you can add and own aspects that make these lists even longer, but let's take them as example to continue throughout the next slides. Leading collaborative innovation companies master 5 dimensions that we have collected here. They, first of all, are able to prepare those collaborations, those partnerships, by 3 steps, being the defined purpose, and they can access the business case for collaborative innovation. Then the development of organizational and cultural readiness, so they can put themselves in a mode being ready to jump into partnerships. They are able to leverage networks to scout and attract appropriate partners. which helps then down the road throughout the innovation funnel, which is here exemplary sketched in the middle of the slide, where you have the funnel starting from the idea generation, where you probably have a large set of ideas that is then reduced more and more in the funnel towards idea selection, prototyping, development, project launch, and finally market launch and hopefully break even. What you also see here is a mix of internal and external sources and resources, collaboration possibilities between internal and external resources, and the red dots being ideas or features moving in or out of the funnel. So there might be adaptations coming in at a later stage, whereas in the beginning there are already some dropouts of features or ideas. That is the first 3 steps and the whole block of prepare and preparation. The second block, partner or partnerships, includes the 4th step or the 4th dimension, setting up a win-win partnership, and that can be specific to any of the 3 steps along the lifecycle management, be it the rather strategic part of defining search fields and idea generation, be it the idea selection and project launch prototyping, or the final market launch and continuous development. And finally, the 5th dimension and the 3rd big block of very successfully collaborative innovators in terms of how to prepare and partner and now pioneer is that they continuously adapt thriving and rewarding partnerships. They are not in a routine or still standing manner, but they're continuously working on this and continuously thriving to make even more out of an already well-functioning innovation-related culture. Now, coming to the last couple of slides, already also looking on the timeline, unique challenges can inhibit collaborative innovation culture. Yes, it is depending on each of these steps. And we said before, there's a difference between young and more established companies, and that is also true for each of these 3 steps. So be it for the prepare, the partner, or the pioneering step, there are differences, and sometimes you might find, well, not so much differences, but more commonalities. Speaking the same language, which is on the bottom left for the young companies, obviously is also important to have established that in the well, more corporate or more established companies. Speaking the same language is the one example I want to highlight out of all of these unique challenges that you can see here as examples, which is the must-have as common ground for the whole partnership to be functioning, for the whole innovation culture to be functioning across your entity's borders. Now, jumping to my last slide, and then I'm very happy to hand back to Martha and Alexandra for some Q&A, and I'm happy to dive into your questions. The best practice of collaborative innovation that we see involves an open, collaborative, and adaptive culture. And that is kind of the last sentences and what I want to give you and to suggest you to adapt and to think through, maybe to even implement within your organizations. When it comes to innovation culture and how to overcome cultural barriers in innovation, first, be open. And that is meant in a personal and also a business-wise sense. Cultural acceptance and the dialogue, the transparency, the common language of what is meant is really essential. There's a couple of additional best practices mentioned here as use senior managers as champions, have them be role models to live that. On the second part, collaborative win-win mindsets. Set up and embrace uncertainty. Be willing to adapt. Maybe try agile work methods in order to find a common ground and learn jointly, which also then nurtures a common culture in terms of innovation related culture. Develop new IP schemes or establish lean governance structures, all working in the same direction to set up a mindset that is oriented towards a win-win, a true win-win for all included partners. And finally, be adaptive. The future focus of collaborative innovation and the culture that is then needed beyond the own borders shares and integrates knowledge. It searches for adding mutual gains to add more value, to generate more than is established at the moment. Manage expectations and be frank about challenges. Right? Dive into the unknown and be collaborative in addressing it. And first of all, in order to achieve all this, please be open and stay open in terms of cultural differences for innovation. Then I'm sure that you're able to overcome the barriers that you might be facing or your clients might be facing as of now. That was all from my side. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope you enjoyed this brief introduction into this topic. And now I'm handing back to Martha and Alexandra. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Manuel, for the presentations. Very much interesting. And then we have already a couple of questions on the chat. I will read it out to you so you can dive into it and then discuss about it. Okay, so first question is that, are there instances of businesses that have faced high cultural barriers to innovation, but in fact become more productive despite the barriers? Can we assume that cultural diversities can sometimes advocate innovation process?
Okay, I think the most honest answer is the one you least want to hear, is it depends. So can we have, if I get that correctly, and maybe Martha, you wanna jump back on that, on my understanding, if barriers might be helpful in order to be innovative, is that how we could sum it up?
Yes, I think that's could be a point of the question.
Yeah, so obviously to come up with innovations, with solutions in terms of products or services, maybe even processes or business models, can also be based on seeing cultural barriers as opportunities rather than challenges, right? So, and that is something that maybe is true for me personally, but maybe for some of you as well. Seeing challenges not too much of something that is hindering, but more as something that is inviting you to, well, turn it into opportunities. And then I can imagine that certain challenges and certain barriers between different cultural aspects can lead to innovation as well. Absolutely. I would, however, argue that in the end, if the innovation then is implemented, probably this innovation might help to overcome exactly the barrier that was then the opportunity to think about this innovation in the first time. So I would maybe finalize or sum this question, or my answer at least, sum it up as, yes, it might depend, and sometimes cultural barriers can lead to innovation. Ultimately, I still think they will be overcome and then lead to something better than before.
Mm-hmm. Very well. Thank you, Manuel, for that. We have another one who is asking, for true innovation, many companies have to rely on people who think differently and not get along well in all social settings. It gives an example, autistic, etc. This also means that these people do not often conform to the business expectations, such as taking notes and then so forth. So in turn, this different worldview allows for focus on not for normal solution. However, the impact on the business structure is often undesired. how do you suggest supporting these innovators within the organization?
Very good question. Maybe starting with the very first part, depending on individuals that might not get good or well along. First time I focused on that is about 15 years back, at the end of my studies somewhere, where I had to differentiate between which conflicts in a company are productive and unproductive. And yes, if you want to come up with innovation, and especially with more radical ones, it is urgent and it's critical that you have different opinions and you have somewhat conflicting arguments and opinions within the entity. However, not on a personal basis, so not on a personal level, but rather on a business level, being the conflict, for example, between marketing and finance controlling, because one side wants to establish a certain product or a program, and the other side has some doubts and has a completely different understanding of this. So yes, conflicts in general are good, but not necessarily on a really interpersonal level, as this might then hinder the cultural possibilities and the atmosphere of being a team and working jointly on innovation. However, this might still happen. And the second part of your question on how to support these circumstances, I think finding the right balance in the team and in the organizational culture, in the innovation culture, overcoming what is then maybe more personal cultural barriers is essential. So aligning the team, and here we go back to the leadership aspect, aligning the team and providing the guidance, the motivational aspects, maybe even the incentives to a team is a leadership task, and can be done accordingly and should be done in a way that you have a common goal, you have a common objective, see it maybe as your North Star, right? You have the North Star you're targeting and where you want to head, and then have the team aligned in a way that if it's obvious that there are certain difficulties, try to have them worked around in the team by still applying the best possible solution to work to a greater good. I can give you one example. A former mentor of mine used to work for IBM, and there was one department in IBM in the States, in the United States, where obviously lots of programmers and programming guys, so software engineering, and one of them was really extraordinary good. So this guy was really an expert in everything he did. However, he had kind of a funny, or at least very seldom, spleen. He used to be best in coding and programming when he was not wearing clothes. So obviously that is something that doesn't work very well with a team atmosphere in an office building. But in order to, well, have them as part of the team, have him being part of the team and achieving the great objectives they wanted to strive for, they did manage to get him an office and just have him wear a bathing. The sauna was the sauna bathing coating whenever he had to leave the room to go to the kitchen for some coffee. So they managed to work around his very specific personal best circumstances to come up with an included cultural aspect of the team's best result-oriented atmosphere, still allowing him to work in a way that he wants, and he was still part of the team, still included. And therefore, I think that is a very nice picture of how you can have very extreme characters join forces and work jointly towards a greater goal. I hope that somewhat is an answer to your question.
Thank you, Manuel. That's a very good example indeed. I think it's very interesting. And jumping into that, there is quite related questions. It is mentioned maybe also could be a case study. So it is said that Kodak had a very innovative culture, but it failed due to the advent of digital camera phones. Was there any cultural innovation barriers in this case? What do you think about it?
Absolutely. I think Kodak is one of the major examples. And yes, if you dive deeper into their example, Kodak in fact did invent the digital camera. And they were afraid of what they had found, and they stored it in the basement. You can look it up. We have it in a couple of our trainings as well. One of the oldest examples of a failure in innovation culture. They encouraged their employees to think ahead, to come up with own innovative projects, and one of them did, and he invented a digital camera within Kodak. And the top management at that time decided to bury it in the ground, and they locked it up in the basement, on the last chamber, you could say, and they locked it away. They were afraid of, well, kind of destroying and substituting their core business, and therefore they asked this employee to not tell anybody. And there's only very rare pictures of him with this camera. And they did not follow up on this innovation. So they did not fail because they were not reacting properly to developments on the market, but they did fail because their own innovation culture internally was already hindering the process and the progress innovation can have on the business. So they were afraid in the very beginning, and they didn't have the the mindset to follow up and to risk what was new at that time.
Very well. We have one more question here. Do you think, Manuel, the innovation prospers when employee culture is homogeneous or heterogeneous? What do you think?
Very good question. I like these questions. Yeah, first answer that pops in my head is, again, it depends, but let me try to dive into both scenarios. If you have very homogeneous atmosphere, culture, maybe even skill set, personalities in the team, that is very, very good if you're working extremely concentrated towards one goal. For example, if we take the IBM's similar case, right? If you are in a startup and you have 5, 6, 7 people, extremely homogeneously in terms of their strength, in terms of their thoughts, in terms of the goals they believe in, great team to set up the new, I don't know, the next SAP, right? Excellent, perfect. In that perspective, maybe they absolutely know what they're talking about. Maybe they have been on the customer side already, so they know what kind of feature is required, how does it look like, and what's best perceived for the customer. So great, perfect team. If you are, if you take the media industry, for example, and you have the program department in the broadcaster. So these people are responsible to set the program in the TV channels, for example. If you would have a very homogeneous team in that aspect, probably the channel would more or less look the same throughout the day, right? There wouldn't be too much difference in terms of what kind of program would be shown. It would more or less be the same. That might be interesting for a day or 2 or 3, and then after a week you would not continue to watch this channel. Now, if you have a rather heterogeneous team in that situation, they might divide the day into time slots and say, well, we're gonna have something different in the morning, around noon, in the afternoon, and at night. So their heterogeneous teams might be more of a benefit. And as you probably realized that I'm now jumping between industries and situations. If I narrow it down to I have to come up with innovative ideas for my business, whatever it has to be, and I have a team of 6-7 people, would I rather have it homogeneous or heterogeneously staffed? I think heterogeneously is, after all, leading to more outcome, to more diverse outcome, maybe even to outcome where people exactly why they, because they think otherwise and they include other experience, might add even more thoughts and features and possible solutions. And just as a quick example, basically from us, from Improve, we have a set of business-focused people working as consultants. We have mathematicians, we have language experts, we have a studied historian. So we have different aspects and insights from various backgrounds, making or forming a heterogeneous team. And I think that is then at the end what probably leads to a bit higher degree of innovation.
Wow, indeed, it's very much reflectful and insightful for us. It reminds me of one of interesting Harvard Business Review article that question asks, should the management hire the same people or completely different? So I think it's some food for thought, as indeed. And also from the participant, we have one remarks, I would say, because it's not a question. It is say that openness looks like the critical feature of innovation. So I think we can agree on this as well.
Yeah.
All right. Manuel, that's all the question that we have. Also, that even though we're exceeding the time, but I believe that all of our participants are very eager to stay with us until the end, as the discussion is very interesting and also relevant for all of us. So from my side, I thank you very much. Do you have any other end remarks for everyone?
Well, thanks. A big thank you to you for hosting and having me here today. That was my pleasure, in fact. And I think your contacts are on the slides anyway. So I think towards the participants, thanks for your participation, for your interest in this topic, for listening. Please reach out to Martha, Alexandra, or also myself in terms you want to dive into more detail on that. And I think, Martha, you already said a nice, you read a nice comment as kind of the last sentence. Yes, I think openness is something that is really essential in being then successful with innovation, and then that cultural aspects do also require openness to identify them, come up with solutions on how to maybe combine or overcome potential hurdles, and then achieve the full potential that is based on innovation management. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Manuel. And Alexandra, do you have any other remarks?
Well, thank you everyone for staying with us during the webinar. Thank you, Manuel, also from my side. And for the participants, if you would like to watch more webinars or read other documents about doing business in emerging markets, you can visit our website at qbin.eu. And for more updates and news, you can also subscribe to our newsletter or follow us on social media. So that's all also from my side. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Alessandra. And also one last remarks for everyone, that after this, we will share around the presentation slides from Manuel so that everyone can refer to that. And also the webinar recordings will be available in our website. So please make sure that you visit our website. And then also a little bit of survey of this webinar will be also sent to you as well. And without further ado, thank you very much. That's all from my side. And then thank you again for staying with us, and have a great rest of the day for everyone. Thank you. Thanks, Manuel, Alessandra.
Thanks you. Stay safe, everybody. Have a good day. Bye.
Thank you.
Goodbye.